Posebno mi je zadovoljstvo biti ovdje sa vama. Ovo je zapravo prvi puta da držim predavanje i da sam u mogućnosti zapravo nešto držati ovdje nakon 14 godina odlaska iz Hrvatske. Jako zanimljivo predavanje docentice Turkelj i profesora Henigsberga. I ja se zahvaljujem isto tako profesoru Mimici što je organizirao ovako interesantan program. Ovo je zaista odlično. S druge strane, da predstavim možda sebe i profesora Kasla, ja sam psihijatar za mlade, trenutno radim u Ministarstvu zdravstva za Tasmaniju u organiziranju psihijatrijske službe za mlade. U tom sam poslu već nekakvih 8 godina. Specijalizirala sam u Hrvatskoj i u Australiji. I eto, tamo me život odveo. Profesor Kassel je profesor na nekoliko sveučilišta u svijetu. Trenutno radi drži katedru na sveučilištu u Tasmaniji. On je svoj put odradio od Maudsley Hospitala u Londonu nadalje. I još jednom zadovoljstvo nam je biti ovdje. Izabrala sam ovu temu zato što je možda malo drugačija i nešto na što mi u kliničkoj situaciji možda nedovoljno često pitamo i ne obraćamo pažnju, a vrlo je bitno najviše zbog kontinuiranosti terapije. Jer kako svi znamo, naši pacijenti vrlo često pristaju uzeti terapiju, ali nedovoljno dugo uzimaju tu terapiju onako kako bi trebali. Nadam se da se nećete uvrijediti ako ovo držim na engleskom i David će mi se pridružiti u drugoj polovici. Dugi uvod, sorry. So just a little bit of a background, and I'm sure you all know about it, but it's a sort of a nice introduction. So we have antidepressants today that are first line of medication that we prescribe in a range of disorders. This is something that is our daily prescribing armamentarium. And in Croatia and all across the world, we have well-known groups of antidepressants, from SSRIs, SNRIs. I'm not going to read all of them, but this is something that we encounter in prescribing every day for a range of disorders. But what do we know about side effects of antidepressants? And what do we know about the prevalence of prescribing of antidepressants? So, couple of interesting studies have looked at prevalence across the world. So in the United States, 13% of adults take antidepressant. In Canada, there's an increase in prescribing antidepressants from 9 to 13% in 6 years. In UK, prescription is 170% higher than in 2000, so the beginning of the 2000. Worldwide, we have a stable incidence of prescribing, but there is rising prevalence. Side effects are common, and 40% of our patients experience some physical or emotional side effects on antidepressants. So what are the side effects? If we look at the physical side effects, it is interesting. This study by Carvalho looked at youth and adults separately. So in youth, you have early emerging side effects, we all know, GI symptoms, insomnia, tiredness, sedation with some antidepressants, activation, we talked about it before, and late emerging side effects, hyperhidrosis, headaches, vivid dreams, xerostomia, weight gain, very, very important one in especially young females, and sexual dysfunction. In adults, very similar, But we also know that in adults, with adulthood and older population, there are a number of different medical illnesses that coincide. So we can find that the complexity of side effects actually increases. Today we're going to talk about emotional blunting. So that is one of the emotional side effects. I'm not sure what would be the right Croatian translation, and I will leave it to you guys. But this is a long-term emerging side effect. It has a huge role in decision on treatment continuation for people. Incredible, but it does. So several surveys that looked at emotional blunting. So we have one survey in 2017. It's a pretty large number of participants, right? 71% of users actually reported some level of emotional blunting, numbness. There's a different, the terminology varies. So there's no coherent sort of unified decision on what terminology is the best, but emotional blunting is used most commonly. Then you have another survey, 1,747 users. 54 had positive experience, meaning they felt better on taking antidepressant. 16% negative with prominent emotional numbing, and 28% had mixed experience. And that's a very nice New Zealand study. Who wants to look at it? It's a quite nice study from 2016. 27 of 161 interviewed users by Hughes in 2017 quit their antidepressant because they felt their affect was narrow. They could not experience their emotions fully. It's a 30% large number. A bit of a history. So first known description of emotional blunting comes from actually 1990s. So this is a little case series of 5 patients with OCD who developed this emotional indifference on fluoxetine and fluvoxamine. So when they actually took them off treatment, the OCD symptoms worsened, but the emotional indifference actually improved. We also know that for 20 years it's recognized in clinical practice. It is part of the clinical picture. Is it only part of the side effect? Is it only a side effect of antidepressant, or is it part of the illness? We'll talk about it a bit later. But it's also important to know that emotional blunting is not specific for depression. Like we see it in post-traumatic stress disorder, we see it in dissociative states. We see a little bit different version that we know is emotional blunting, affective blunting in schizophrenia, but it is different. So, what is it? It's actually a condition, a cluster of symptoms. Restricted emotions, detachment, reduced responsiveness to emotional stimuli, low motivation and apathy. It's most commonly researched in relation to treatment of major depressive disorder. How do our patients describe this? They feel numb, they're less able to laugh or cry, they sort of feel less empathy. That's an interesting one. I had a patient who graduated, and they were like, I graduated, but they just could not feel it. It's that cognitively you could sort of say, okay, that's great, but they did not feel it. They lack inspiration or passion in creative activities, and that's an interesting one. They feel reduced, that's what the patients say, right? They feel reduced social responsibility or concern for other people. So cognitively, that concern is there, but emotionally they don't feel it. So how common is emotional blunting in management of depression? So 40 to 66 patients on an SSRI or SNRI have some degree of emotional blunting. it is a prominent side effect leading to discontinuation of medication, as previously said. 1/3 of patients considered stopping or have stopped antidepressant as a result of emotional blunting. So, is it only a side effect of antidepressant, or are we actually looking at part of the depression manifesting as that kind of emotional blunting? So we have a nice study looking at acute phase of major depression and looking at patients who had remission. So comparison was with the same scale, with the Oxford Depression Questionnaire. It's a very nice scale focused on measuring emotional blunting. So 72% of patients in acute major depressive episode reported blunting. 62% attributed that to depression. When we look at the patients who in remission, 25%, so a quarter of them actually still reported severe blunting, even though their symptoms of depression improved. But 52 of those 25% said, well, I think it's still my depression, it's still my illness. In both groups, 45% of patients believe that an antidepressant contributed to blunting of emotions. So there's still this huge proportion of patients thinking, oh, medication is doing something to me that I actually do not want to experience. So is it a part of illness process or is it a side effect? There are a few clinical and research data on this. And the interest obviously is about, first, you want to achieve remission of a patient with depression. You want them to have actually functioning life, right? And the second thing is, do we actually have to think about how we're prescribing? Do we actually have to psychoeducate? What can be helpful? I have sort of separated this in arguments that are arguing for emotional blunting being effect of the antidepressant treatment and emotional blunting being actually unresolved illness process. So Sanson in 2010 noted that emotional blunting actually is related to antidepressant because he saw dose response effects. So the higher you go with antidepressant dose, more severe blunting people experience. And McCabe did this nice functional MRI study where they actually have given healthy volunteers citalopram and reboxetine, and they looked at the reward circuitry, and what they've seen is that with citalopram there's this sort of reduced experience of positive and aversive reduced experience, to positive and to aversive and rewarding stimuli. And I find it fascinating. Like you give someone citalopram for a short term and you get this sort of result, really looking at serotonergic effect on the reward circuitry and how it dampens that activation to the different stimuli. So they haven't noticed that with reboxetine. We know reboxetine has effect on noradrenaline, right? And this is where we come to neurobiology of emotional blunting. Obviously, these are all hypotheses. We don't know much. Serotonergic system is involved, but it seems like serotonergic modulation of dopaminergic system is actually something that is the underlying majority of these symptoms. So, how do we measure emotional blunting? So current literature, we have few focus scales, most of them not validated, apart from the Oxford Depression Questionnaire. And a lot of studies that looked at emotional blunting previously have actually extrapolated from MADRS, Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale. And that's the item, inability to feel. That's a nice item. If you look through it, it has this inability to feel pleasurable inability to experience pleasurable events as pleasurable, and inability to actually experience sad experiences as sad. So this is where my talk ends. I was quite anxious, I have to say.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I do have something I don't usually share with a lot of other people, but I am actually an artificial intelligence. The really good news for you is I have great empathy and theory of mind, and I know you're all just dying for lunch. So this will be quite short. The bad part is I'm a very old model, so I only do English. Unfortunate. I can order coffee in Croatian, but it would not get me through emotional blunting discussion. We have heard about the ability to experience joy. There's fascinating talk about emotional intelligence and with the overlap with artificial intelligence. And one of the things I think about all the artificial intelligence people, they don't have a sense of humor, but that's not that uncommon in Americans anyway, because they don't have a sense of ironic humor. But in Australia, we get pleasure from this rather curious game called Australian Football League. And that's Australia, by the way. Australia's a very large island just south of China. And we play this game called AFL. And you can see if you are going to support your team playing AFL, and that's my team, the Hawks, and when they win, I feel fantastic. When they lose, I feel really dreadful. People who have emotional blunting cannot feel either the joy or the sorrow. It's like, if anybody has heard about a film called Lassie. Lassie was an old film about a dog which gets lost and then finds its way back eventually to its owners. It's extraordinarily sad. If you don't cry when you watch Lassie, you're emotionally blunted. Is it different from depression? It is different from depression because it lacks the pain of depression. One of the analogies I use is depression is like walking on hot coals, very painful. Treatment with an SSRI in particular is like putting a big rubber sole on your shoes, on your feet, so you don't feel the pain of the depression, but you feel out of touch with the world on some level. Other people describe it as looking at the world through perspex. I'm going to leave this with you because it's a silly question. It says, how would you treat somebody who you know very little about? Says 23-year-old woman, first choice intervention, what would your next step be? What would your next step be? Well, none of us practice like this, of course, because we actually listen to the patient and we try and make the best decision for the patient. But there's a study which did this, and that's a study called STAR-D, which the NIMH sponsored, which essentially took a formulaic approach to treatment of depression. You've got to get an antidepressant, obviously, which is effective, tolerated, and we've heard a lot about that today, and they've got to be taken. Antidepressants don't usually work if you just rub them on to your skin. This is STAR-D. This is a sum from Ray Lamb, a very nice Canadian colleague, and what he did was to sum up the remission rates for each step of STAR-D. So they all went on to citalopram. That's an SSRI. 36% responded, and then either switched or combined, and you get another little increase in efficacy, and then these other more tertiary, third-line treatments, things like adding lithium and T3 and so forth. And it was meant to be a sort of real-life study. And you can see that the efficacy at each point, it's a law of diminishing returns. And they didn't really ask the question of themselves with STAR-D as to why it did so badly. They said, oh, well, psychiatrists and antidepressants are not very good. Well, that's not right. Actually, again, being an artificial intelligence, I can work out which profile of person I'm going to give which antidepressant to. And it's an interesting story about the emotional blunting side effect, because some people don't mind it, and most people don't like it at all. And I had a patient who was very instructive. She was on a drug called agomelatine, valdoxan, which doesn't tend to cause emotional blunting, and her depression was a whole lot better. And she came back to me and said, I'm very happy with you, Dr. Castle, but I actually want to be on an SSRI. And I said, why? And she said, I've got a friend on SSRI, and she says she doesn't feel things. And I actually want to be like that. So this I found extremely curious. And the detail of her story was one of trauma. So she actually wanted to chemically bring in that shut down feeling of a response to trauma where she didn't feel the emotions and didn't have to deal with the agonies of her inner life. So all of these things need to be brought into your decision-making about antidepressants, side effects, and what the person will tolerate. Do not make an assumption about them. The types of illness. And then we ask this question, which is a very interesting question about prediction of response. And of course, we have pharmacogenetics. I don't know how big that is in Croatia. It's used quite a lot in some practices in Australia, but is actually a very blunt instrument. This is a lovely, rather scathing review by Zubenko in, I think, Archives of General Psychiatry, JAMA Psychiatry, saying antidepressant dosing doesn't need to be guided by PGen, but by careful choice and monitoring therapeutic and adverse effects. And with those adverse effects, we should include our emotional blunting. This is another way of looking at it. Can you predict by brain circuitry? Well, this is from McGrath and colleagues. And what they did was to show in a very interesting study where people got either escitalopram or cognitive behavior therapy, those who responded to cognitive behavior therapy had hypometabolism in their right insula, as opposed to those who responded to antidepressants. And that was in part reconfirmed by this lovely study from Dunlop. It's called PREDICTS. And they took a larger group of patients, they randomized them to CBT or to escitalopram, and again, and found this functional connectivity, callosal cingulate cortical connectivity measure, which predicted response to CBT and failure of medications. This is just what Australians do, not much. I'm going to move on now to the 7 minutes I have left to talk about emotional blunting and what you do about it. A lot of this work comes from the lab of Guy Goodwin in Oxford and a lady called Catherine Harmer. And Catherine Harmer has done a whole lot of studies where she would show people positively valenced and negatively valenced exposures. So remember what I said earlier about emotional blunting. It takes the top out of your joy and it takes the bottom out of your misery, but you in the middle all the time. So she used from the top, what's something which everybody loves? Chocolate. That was the positively valenced thing. What do people not like? Well, she used rotten strawberries. It's the negatively valenced emotion. And did a whole lot of studies, including the ones which Anna shared with you about how SSRIs impact that, and then looked at other drugs and saw how they impacted the same test. But this is what people say. I feel deadened. I feel apathetic. Even using this term affect, flat affect, emotionally cut off. And Guy's group then went and looked at actually interviewing patients and really emphasized this notion of a general effect on all emotion, on positive and negative emotions. My colleague Mal Hopwood and I put together this scale, which is a very brief scale, which asks about the response to a sad event, response to a happy event. And you can see a sad movie. It's a very good one to ask. It also asks about whether you're still engaged in things. It also asks about sexual intimacy, which is related but separate. And we found in a general practice sample that a lot of people on antidepressants had emotional blunting, and that's been shared with you. And we also then looked at the literature and asked whether this was a specific serotonin effect. And the long and the short is, it does seem to be a specific serotonin effect, and the neurobiology you've been shown already. So what are the antidepressants which we have? You see, now I have a negatively valenced response to this colleague walking out on me. Did I say something horrible? No. Okay, no one else, please walk out, I will feel bad. Agomelatine is a melatonergic agonist and also blocks 5-HT2C receptors postsynaptically. And this is a study which is against escitalopram. The depression effect, antidepressive effect, was equal in both drugs, but the response to this item of people caring less about things than they used to before the treatment was very markedly different, with a much higher response in escitalopram to that prompt question, and that then was looked at a study from Italian group against venlafaxine. Both drugs were very effective in terms of the amelioration of anxiety and depressive symptoms, but you can see a big difference in terms of the change in emotional blunting scores. Madam Chair, I will finish on time. The other drug, which is not serotonergic and which is a drug which we don't use all that much in Australia because it's very expensive, but that is bupropion. It's a very big favorite in North America and especially commonly used where SSRIs are not tolerated for various reasons, including sexual side effects and emotional blunting. And it works through reuptake inhibition of dopamine and noradrenaline, so nothing to do with serotonin. And you can see the studies, again, this group of McCabe, it's Catherine Harmer's lab, showing these increased neural responses to rewarding and adverse stimuli. These are healthy volunteer studies, by the way, and they're short-term studies. And there's a problem with that methodology, if you think about it, because antidepressants take some time to work, whereas these effects are very immediate. So I'm not sure what we make of that. And the final drug, which is a little bit different, is this drug called vortioxetine. Do you have vortioxetine? Yeah. So it was put on the market. A lot of people said anyway, it was just a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but actually it isn't. It's a very, very complex drug. It does inhibit reuptake, but it also has 5-HT1A, 1B, 1D, 5-HT3, and is an antagonist at 5-HT7, which has to do with cognition. So the fact that all of these complexities within the molecule mean that not only is it an antidepressant and an SSRI, it also is very helpful for anxiety, by the way, but also doesn't cause the rate of sexual dysfunction and doesn't cause the rate of emotional blunting as the SSRIs. I've talked already about trauma, so I won't talk more about that. I'll just show you sexual dysfunction. This is a very big problem with all of these drugs, sertraline, venlafaxine, citalopram, and so forth. And that is not a problem with placebo, or in a few people, and that's agomelatine, and that's mirtazapine. So again, sexual dysfunction, emotional blunting, very much serotonergic issues. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to overstay my welcome, but I wanted to thank you so much for your attention and thank you for the option for me to speak in English. I will now order a coffee. dupli espresso, malo mlijeki, se strana, toplon.